Good morning, everybody. We're going to give a minute or two just to make sure everybody gets in through the Zoom travel portal, and then we will begin session 1 of the Forest Carbon University. All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to part 1 of our 5-part series of the Forest Carbon University. My name is Melinda Gable, and I'm the Executive Director of the Forest Landowners Foundation. And we're really excited to have our speaker today and also throughout this webinar series, and looking forward to being able to share with everybody a little deeper dive into the voluntary carbon market. The Forest Landowners Foundation and Association works with landowners across the country to help provide information and resources that give them the decision-making tools to manage their forest lands and the capacity that they see fit for their ownership objectives and goals. What we're hoping to do throughout this series is to go a little deeper into the whole voluntary carbon market space and exactly where is the lay of the land and where is it going. We did a survey leading up to this webinar series to really see what is it landowners know about voluntary carbon markets, what's confusing to them, what do they want to know more of, and we will share those results with you as well via email, also be on our website. But some of the things that was a constant echo question is, how are the carbon credits determined on your forest land? And then once they're determined, how are they sold into the marketplace? And once they're sold, how does some of that percentage of the revenue come back to the landowner, or where does it go? What determines the price of the carbon credits? What's the legality of the contract? So we're hoping through today with Melissa Cray, head of the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program, as well as a professor at Penn State, that we're going to get to some of those answers for you. But also, I would encourage you to join the webinars throughout this series, because we've purposefully set it up to have individual presentations by some of the most common marketplace providers today that you see on this screen in the space, and to give you that opportunity with those providers individually, so you can dig deep into their program and how their contracts work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Cray, who has graciously agreed to stay online today so we can answer questions. So if we go over an hour, we're going to stay here and make sure we answer your questions. We'll also be providing some links in the chat of different resources, as well as emails. Feel free to contact myself if you have questions following this. Our goal is to give you the information you need throughout this series, and then also through our Forest Carbon University online, which will be launching later this month. So with that, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Melinda. I was very happy that I was asked to come and talk today. And so I got to look at that survey that Melinda just mentioned. And I went through and I looked at the questions that were being, that were needed, had a lot of people wanted answers to. And so the areas that I felt like I could speak to, I'm going to try and speak to. And then there's just going to be some places where there aren't answers yet. But we're, as time, that's just because time hasn't passed. As a researcher, we operate in the realm of data, and access to that data is our barrier to our knowledge. So what I do is I actually try and teach people about systems, or how things work and how they might impact them. Because I believe, the same thing that most adult learners think. It's like, tell me what to do, but don't tell me what to do, And so I'm here to not tell you anything other than maybe you should know about how things are understood to work, so you can ask the questions to the people who may have the answers if we don't. My field of study is in biology and human behavior, so I'm not a earth scientist, I'm not an ecologist, and I work the work that I do applies in forest policy and economics. So there's like the forest context for sure, but just so you know that that I'm going to be speaking out of my expertise for the most part. And what I do as an educator is not only talk about how systems work, what we know, but I also talk about how confident we are in what we know too. So the voluntary market space is not a land of a lot of facts, unfortunately. And we have to kind of live with that, and just understand what these systems, what forces are in these systems that are driving things. Okay, so what is driving interest in forest carbon? So forests have the largest climate change mitigation potential of any terrestrial system. Oceans have a lot of influence too, but on terrestrial land, forests have a lot of potential. Here's a figure from the Environmental Protection Agency that talks about where the carbon is in the forest, and 30% of it is in the living wood, the standing wood. So that means even though forests have a lot of potential as far as how much carbon is in them and how much they take up, we can only manage that 30% that is in the living biomass. So we have to keep that in mind. Also, forests already in the US already offset up to 11% of emissions. In the US, the trajectory has been for the last 2 days to really just slow down on extracting trees and letting trees grow. It's not any sort of, there's been no like agenda. It's just that on public and private lands, people are just taking less wood out. And so that's already offsetting emissions. And compared to like forests in Europe, they manage them to right to the edge. So their forests are only starting to be managed to offset emissions. We're already doing it just by default. There is some research that says that we could potentially offset another 10% of emissions through forest management. And the question I have, and I don't have the answer for, but I think is important, and maybe one that you want to consider when you think about managing for carbon, or what are the other ecosystem services that may be impacted by changes in your management. And ecosystem services is timber, non-timber forest products, biodiversity, water resource protection, all the other things that the forest provides. So if we change our management, it's going to have that kind of ripple effect on those things. And so that's one of the questions I personally have, and I don't have the answer to, but it's something that if I had a particular site or place in mind, that maybe you could start to answer that question. Public opinion. This is a poll from Yale University. They do a survey every year. A lot of people, 71% of US Americans are worried about climate change impacts to plant and animals. They're less worried about impacts to humans. They're more worried about plants and animals, which means they're looking at private forest lands. Most people, 70% of people, think corporations should do something about climate change, and only 57% think that governors should do something about climate change. Governors are the ones that are backing the enrollment of states into regional initiatives that use that cap and trade regulated structure. corporations are backing the voluntary market. So there's a lot of public support for corporations who are choosing to go with the voluntary market. And the reason why is because they have these corporate goals. They have environmental, social, and corporate governance ratings that they want to have go up. And this basically shows that they are responsible across a range of areas, including environmental protection. And this way that this is how they can basically get more investors and get better loans, et cetera. So they're trying to increase their ESG rating. So if you're asking who's buying carbon, anyone with an ESG rating is probably buying carbon offsets, I think is a pretty good chance. And so because they're a corporation, they prefer trade-based solutions when it comes to offsetting their environmental impact. They don't like the idea of carbon taxes, and offsets are cheaper than technology right now. So actually investing in sort of change in infrastructure is relatively expensive, a lot of sunk costs. But if you can pay someone to change their land use, it's a little cheaper. So this is the way corporations want to meet their ESG, improve their ESG ratings, is through the voluntary market. And it seems to be a good idea on the part of a lot of people. So a lot of agencies and interest groups and legislative committees see opportunities for leveraging corporate money for social good. So they're backing, the idea of voluntary markets. Forest owners like the idea of getting paid for something they're doing already, which, is already like a red flag. Is that additional? That's something that we're going to talk about. But it's sort of in their wheelhouse. They own this. So, the idea of getting paid for it is really appealing. And of course, NGOs. So, for example, you're going to have folks representing the Nature Conservancy see an opportunity for increasing preservation and restoration programs. So being a good outcome for the forest. There's a link to an article here written in the Journal of Forest, which is open access, public access, and they kind of talk about this very thing, like why is it that carbon markets are on the voluntary market are really kind of taking off. Now, how is the marketplace expected to work? So I had it written down, how does the marketplace work? Well, I changed it. How's it expected to work? There's a number of economic actors involved here that you may recognize. So we already talked about who these buyers are. Those are the corporations that want to offset their carbon footprint. And then there's the project developer, which you will be meeting in the rest of the upcoming weeks, and they're going to be talking about their programs. So the project developer comes up basically with the protocol or project idea for sequestering carbon that they're saying is going to result in the provision of a credit, a carbon credit that can be traded. So that can be sold on the voluntary market. And so they often work with buyers to sort of get like a little pre-interest in feedback, because developing these protocols and developing these projects takes some money. So they need investors. So they want to know that they've got buyers out there. Another important actor are the carbon registries. These are the guys who are responsible for tracking what is bought and sold and what the value is, and that the protocols that are being used meet some level of being, you could say, legitimate or being secure, in that what is being bought and sold is actually what is being promised. So it's this idea of the Securities Exchange Commission says registered, commodities have some guarantees with it. And so carbon registries are trying to do that. Some project developers are a carbon registry too, which makes it a little bit confusing, but they do have third-party verifiers as well. Now, project developers, they use big data and artificial intelligence in their own databases to kind of come up with these projects and what kinds of protocols that they can reasonably meet. And as of now, they haven't really started talking to you, the forest owner, yet. I mean, in the last decade they have, but it isn't really until they've established their program and their protocols and found buyers do they start talking to forest owners. And so that's why a lot of you are like, what's going on? We knew this was coming, but you didn't know anything about it. And the other challenge too is that there's no one necessarily representing the collective interest of forest owners when it comes to carbon markets, because it is sort of something that's occurring independently in that voluntary market platform area. And this can be a little intimidating. I appreciate the hesitancy, but then also the great interest in this area. So this is kind of the order of operations of how this market was sort of coming about, and who the major actors are. And the forest owners are kind of coming in at the tail end. Now, let's talk about the voluntary market here real quick. These next few figures are from an article that I've linked down below from Financial Times, and they did a big spread. It's a little old, it's a couple years old, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the market. The voluntary market has been growing consistently and is expected to continue to grow, especially since now we have established this ESG kind of rating for corporations, and public will to address climate change is going to keep this thing going. The most popular types of offset projects are forestry and land use, and they are also the most valuable projects being traded in the voluntary market. The locations of these projects are mostly in the US, followed by India and China. So, that's why they're here. That's why you're hearing about them. Now, this is the part that I think is of interest to everyone, because there's this question of like, how much should I expect to get paid? Who's getting what? Am I getting a fair deal? It's really hard to untangle. These are a number of registries that sell carbon offsets. And this is a price range from 2018. So the American Carbon Registry sold anywhere between, I got to move my little screens around so I can see here, $9.34 for a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then that was arranged up to $11.70 a ton. But then the gold standard, they ranged from $4 or $5 a ton all the way up to $47 a ton. The verified carbon standard ranged from, $4 a ton all the way up to $21 a ton. So the variation has to do with the kinds of projects that are designed, the protocols that are used, and what buyers want, what those corporations want. Those corporations have their own agenda. Some of them are like, I just want a pure offset. And some of them are like, well, we want a project that also supports rural communities, or we want a project that is located in this area. And so they have, those corporations or the buyers are they have their customers too. They have their preferences, and they're looking for the product at the right price that meets their objectives. And so that's why there's these different price ranges for offset projects, and that's because not every project is the same. And so the project developers that you're going to be talking to in the coming weeks, they have a different commodity. The way that they package it is different, who they sell it to is different, and what prices they sell it at is going to be different too. But that price is negotiated between them and the buyer. And they have ways of getting the landowner involved in negotiation too, but it's not a completely transparent system. And that's because of this. The voluntary market and these projects, when it comes to non-industrial private forest lands, is at this final stage of innovation called scaling. So the 4 stages start with like developing a business model, identifying how you're going to address a particular problem, finding someone to help invest in it. So, where are you going to fit this product? And the question now is at scalability. How do we actually make this happen in the real world? Everything that, we can make it all on paper look good, and people are going to say, yeah, I'll buy from you, your carbon. These projects you're going to put together, but actually making it happen is a little bit more challenging, because they're basically handling negotiations on 2 sides, with the buyers, with the corporations, and then also with the landowners, and then they're also trying to make sure that they meet what they guaranteed they said they would do as far as their protocols are working, are defensible. And sometimes they have to evolve. So part of the reason why there's a lack of transparency is not so much that the information is being hidden on purpose as much as it is changing quite often in order to help deal with the scaling problems that occur. And so I'm not here to say anybody's a good guy or bad guy or anything. It's just that when we're talking about such an immature market and the commodity is not registered and it's being created, it's being defined, that the innovations in this area are occurring right now. And the proof in the pudding is sort of happening right now at the scalability stage. So it's a moving target. So, but there are things that are consistent. I know you're telling me that you can't tell me anything, but there are some things that are consistent. So offset projects have to meet some basic requirements. And these are not all of them, but these are the ones that I thought were really important and to talk about. And that is, they have to define what the baseline is, how they determine the baseline. A lot of people, as I said, use big data, artificial intelligence, et cetera, to establish the point from which changes are going to be made. And then they have to demonstrate that additionality will occur based on the incentives that they plan, the payments that they plan to disseminate. So additionality is basically that the situation where payment should result in changes to management behaviors and carbon storage. If the problem with additionality is that it's not additional if it was business as usual, if it would have happened anyway. So the changes in human behavior is critical in defining additionality. And as a social scientist, I am biased. And I'm like, this is the part that it needs the most focus. How do we know that people are doing something different than they would have before? And does that difference in their behavior lead to additional carbon storage? So additionality is the challenge in this space right now. The other challenge, the twin challenge here, is the concept of permanence, because how confident, the confidence in how well that carbon is permanently stored or how long it is stored adds value to the project. So projects that demonstrate high confidence that the carbon is going to be stored for a significantly long period of time are the more valuable projects. That's the ones that are seen as being a good that is really on a true offset. And then there's this concept of non-leakage. That means, like, if someone doesn't cut down a tree here, it doesn't increase the likelihood that a tree over there will be cut down on another property. So sort of this like ripple effect within the market. If you start changing something in one place, it could result in changes somewhere else, and then they cancel each other out, because if you're protecting one tree here and the other tree gets cut down, they cancel each other out. I don't have the link in here right now, I apologize, but there is a meta-analysis study that looked at a bunch of papers, and they basically found that the leakage problem is pretty big globally with forest projects. Up to 30 to 40% of the carbon that's being traded is actually lost because of that leakage impact, because it's causing change in management somewhere else. And this is basically part of the struggle with doing this work, is accounting for these larger implications. And so these are the basic things that an offset project developer has to kind of justify that they're addressing all of these issues. Now, there's two ways right now of accounting for the carbon, and really what you're doing is you're accounting for the benefit. So it's not so much the carbon, but the expected benefit from storing that carbon. A verified carbon unit is the conventional kind of standard unit, and that is one verified carbon unit is supposed to offset 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere for at least 100 years. If we're going to change the climate or slow down climate change, this long-term removal of that additional carbon is necessary to achieve that goal. And so this is the criteria that's been established. And the way that this promise is kept is that many developers will use a buffer pool. They'll set aside extra acres of forest in case there's something that happens to the forest that is under contract. If there is an act of God kind of situation, a flood, a wildfire, disease, and pests, the idea being that they've got this backup pool of forest that they can say now is included in that good that was sold to the buyer, and that they're still getting that full offset. And so it's the conventional, that's kind of like the ideal outcome right here. But you know who it's not ideal for? It's not ideal for forest owners, because even though most people are invested in their forest, staying forest for extended period of time, we don't even live for 100 years. So that means putting a lien on your property and other kinds of things, which maybe is a level of commitment some people are not ready to do, especially in an immature market. You don't know what you're gonna do. You don't want to just marry the first girl that you think looks good or something like that. Not to be not to be a little oversimplified or offensive there, but it is sort of like a wait and see kind of thing. And so these long contracts are really not appealing. So the innovation really lies in coming up with contracts that don't require these long-term commitment. And one of those that you know about now is this year ton credit or harvest deferral credit. And that's where the benefits are accounted for on an annual basis. So it's a yearly basis. And it's really built on the model of kind of like a pine plantation, where basically a harvest that occurs is like a complete clear cut. It like completely removes all the trees. Now, I'm from Pennsylvania. We don't do clear cuts necessarily here. So this model has sort of got some assumptions that are a little bit different. Most people here do selective kinds of harvesting. But in a complete harvest scenario, this harvest deferral credit, one credit, promises to offset maybe up to about 22 metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's a lot more than 1 metric ton in the verified carbon unit. But those 22 metric tons, or however much it is, depending on how much of wood is taken out, it's only for 1 year. And so it's a lot, but it's for a temporary period. And the way the benefits are estimated is based on earth science kind of principles about radiative forcing effect and how much influence that carbon in the atmosphere would have on global warming. But essentially, this idea of doing these like short-term credits, these year-ton credits, registries are kind of biting, but they're not. And if you've been reading any of the news around this, that Vera sort of stepped away from this, but there's other groups, there's other registries around. I think there's one in Quebec. They're still exploring this idea. But a lot, the thinkers behind this and the registries have sort of said, okay, if we had to compare a year ton credit with a verified carbon unit, the benefits are different because of that difference in permanency. And so a year ton credit is about 1% of the benefit of a verified carbon unit. And so that should be reflected in the value, in the price, because the risks and the permanence is different. And I went ahead and I drew up some figures here. This is not based on data, so please focus on that word up top that says hypothetical model. This is not data-based. I'm using figures to communicate a concept here. So if we're talking about different level of security of the permanence of that carbon, on the left, we have a verified carbon unit over 100 years. The level of security kind of goes up and down because there's going to be 1 or 2 owners. Are they going to follow the rules? Are they going to follow the protocol? There may be a wildfire that comes through. So level of security varies a little bit. There's a buffer in place, but in the end, the level of security is pretty constant. It doesn't really change. But when you talk about level of security with the year ton credit, what is happening is that the football is being passed from owner to owner, because after a year, they can opt out or they can opt back in. And so to maintain that carbon that was sequestered the first year, you have to get at least that same number of people to enroll again the next year, and at least that same number of people to enroll, and on for 100 years. That's the only way that you can like say that it's somehow similar to the verified carbon unit. So this football gets passed, but you know, how successful year to year, how many times you're going to get someone to come back in that is got the same kind of forest and their same kind of the same number of people. And if 1 year it drops below, then, you know, what's the impact on climate? There's just a lot more noise. There's a lot more variation. It's not really understood the trajectory of when that carbon football is passed, how successful that will be. So you can't really compare these two approaches. And this is from my social scientist side. When I look at like, what are the important differences? There's just a lot more variability and the trajectory is unknown. So once again, this is Melissa Cry's opinion as a social scientist, understanding that there's a lot of variation in how people behave and what we can expect from people, which I think is really important. And I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so what should I expect to get paid? Well, unfortunately, carbon prices are still pretty low. So what I tell you today might be different tomorrow. Market data on landowners is really immature. There just aren't enough people enrolled to actually find this out. So what we have to do is we have to look at research that asked people this question before there was a market established. So surveys that have asked people, forest owners, what would you be willing to accept as payment if a carbon market like that looks like this was presented to you? So these are hypothetical scenarios, which makes it challenging to do this research. But the truth is we just don't have enough market data. Not only that, the market data we do have are from early adopters. So these are generally folks that are less risk averse and may have stewardship motives. They're wanting to get involved because it's the right thing, and they're not expecting to have their opportunity costs fully covered, for example. And the opportunity costs of enrolling in a program are relatively unclear for a lot of people. What does it mean? You know, how close should I pay attention to the penalties of early withdrawal? What is the likelihood that I might have to withdraw? And so coming up with future scenarios of what the potential costs are can be really kind of a challenge for the individual forest owner. Although larger landowners, which I think is mostly the case with the folks that are part of this association, are able to diversify investments across their property. So they can set aside some portion where they're like, okay, I'm willing to do a little bit of a riskier investment over here compared to over here. But for smaller landowners, folks with less than 100 acres, the gamble's kind of a stiffer one because they have a lot of programs have minimum number of acres that have to be enrolled. And so meeting that requirement is they have to enroll most of their land. And so it's kind of a gamble. Now, what I did is we did a study, and it was a meta-analysis of landowners' willingness to accept studies. These are surveys that were done in the past throughout the United States that asked forest owners, what would you be willing to accept as payment to be involved in a carbon payments program or carbon market? And we found 13 studies that were comparable, and these provided 33 mean willingness to accept observations. So the studies don't report their raw data. They report the average, you know, payment levels that people preferred for different types of contracts. So we were able to get an average willingness to accept payment number for a variety of about 33 different styles of contracts. But these mean responses represent the responses of about 20,000 plus landowners throughout the United States. Turns out there's a lot of variation. Preferred payment levels ranged anywhere from $6 an acre to $280 an acre. So how do we explain all this variation? Well, one thing that we found when we looked at the demand curves in some of these papers is that half of owners were willing to accept up to 75% less than other half of forest owners. And that's really big. And that has to do with differences in management objectives and ideas about the purpose of owning land, like as far as an investment, what they plan to get out of it. So we did some regression modeling to identify the factors that are driving this variation in willingness to accept. So the dependent variable in the model is mean willingness to accept, and then all the independent variables have to do with the kinds of contracts that were being offered. And this is what we found. So you see here on the left, the variable name. So that would be the number of years in the contract. And we have about 4 categories here: less than 20 years, 20 to 50 years, and over 50 years. We also looked at the influence of how many acres the forest owner has. If the contract requires them to have a management plan, if there is a management restriction, and the management restriction in this case is mostly related to changes in harvesting. And we looked at the effective region, and we looked at also, we have something in a regression model called the error term. And that is where any unexplained variation in the data is all put in that error term. So it's influencing willingness to accept, but we don't know what it means. So these are these undefined opportunity costs that are driving choice, that we just didn't have the data set up in a way, we didn't have the information needed to kind of untangle what those other things were, but that goes in the error term. And what we found was 60% of willingness to pay behaviors are explained by the type of contract and number of acres owned, which is pretty significant. So if you're worried about contracts, a lot of people are. This has a lot to do with the choices that are being made about their decision to enter. It has to do with the type of contract and the number of acres that they own. So, but 40% of willingness to accept behaviors were influenced by things that we couldn't define. And this could be, we weren't able to get a data that would describe consistently across all the studies as in regards to the impact of having certain kinds of penalties, for example, in the contract. There's also variation from landowner to landowner, differences in attitudes towards carbon and climate change, perceptions about risk, and of course their management objectives vary as well. So there's a lot of things that influence what people are willing to pay. Changing harvesting behaviors, it seemed to be like the most important thing. So if you were looking at a contract and you're like, you know, what should I be focusing on as far as like where the opportunity costs are? It's probably going to be around the harvesting behavior, what you're asked to do, what behavior change you're asked to do, and what are the potential costs of opportunity costs of engaging that behavior. So then you can look at like, what is a fair compensation for changing my behavior? And it might be twice as important as contract length. I think that kind of tweaks some people out, like contract length. Oh, how do I compare future values? This is so hard, you know? And so apparently, at least the folks that are also looking to get into carbon programs, who in a supply and demand situation are also putting in their bids, the emphasis is a little bit less on number of years in the contract and a little bit more on what is the management restriction. So what we did is we took this model and we adjusted it to fit the kinds of contracts that would be preferred by certain categories of forest owners. So we were like, not all forest owners are the same. They have different management objectives. They have different acreage sizes. So if we made up these hypothetical categories of forest owners, what is it that they would need to be paid on average? And this is what we came up with. And the link to the study, yeah, I shared that with you earlier. So you can take a closer look at this is kind of a lot of data. You can look that up yourself, but we came up with 3 kinds of forest owners: the passive forest owner, which is the dominant category of non-industrial private forest owners. These are the folks that really don't do any action on their property until they've decided to do something. They're not proactive, they're more reactive in the way they approach forest management. There's the conservation-oriented folks who place a lower priority on timber production and a higher priority in conservation and restoration. Harvesting timber is a means to get some money to help support that larger conservation goal. And then timber production oriented folks are the people that are like, I own land because the goal is to create a commodity that I can sell. And this is the #1 priority. Now, those of you on the call probably fit more than one category. These aren't pure archetypes. Some people kind of designate different parts of their land. This side's for conservation, this side's for timber production, you know, but this way was just to really kind of parse out what the values may be. And so early adopters, we assumed were going to be probably more likely be the passive forest owner and the conservation oriented owner. The passive forest owner, they just like the idea of getting something for maybe not really doing anything. You know, they don't have a high priority on harvesting trees. You know, it's like they'll do it if they get around to it. So the idea of having a steady income to like pay their income taxes, that's appealing. Conservation oriented folks also, they're not scared of long contracts. They're in it for the long run, and they also, the opportunity cost with harvesting might be a little bit less. And so we figured those two categories would probably be the early adopters. And so we constrained their mean willingness to pay using the metric that I said earlier about how half of forest owners are willing to accept up to 75% less. So they got this adjustment to their estimated willingness to accept values. On the left are three different size categories of forest owners: less than 20 acres, 20 to 250 acres, more than 250 acres. What we find is that the passive owners and the conservation oriented owners that have larger acres are willing to accept payment levels that are basically being offered right now through carbon programs. And I think it's mostly because the cost of foregoing timber harvesting is just seen as being less. It's just prioritized a little bit lower. And so, their focus is on something else, paying their taxes or being a good climate and forest steward. And the folks that are like, look, this is a business deal. Either you're going to pay me for my timber or pay me for the carbon, but you're going to pay me a fair price. I don't want to lose out on this transaction. They're asking for quite a bit more, and the price of carbon just isn't high enough yet to appeal to folks that are really invested in timber production, or at least the acres they have designated for timber production. This is what we find. This is just what's found in the literature right now, and it could give you a bit of a signal as far as like who would be other people bidding. Other landowners who are bidding or supporting the direction of innovation in these offset projects, because these are the early adopters. And so, there's a choice that you're having to face with there's a number of uncertainties. You want to do what's right for you, and you want to do not just what's right for you and your land, you want to do what's right for you, but also your other fellow forest owners. And you also want to uphold the reputation of private lands as being a provider of goods to societies. Historically, forest lands provided private goods, what's understood to be private goods that were traded, and it is usually centered around timber production. But now this like public goods kind of market coming in and saying, okay, we're going to regulate climate with forests, it starts to merge like public interests a little bit closer with private forest lands. And this is kind of an intimidating space, because it's important to maintain the integrity and reputation of private forest land. So the choices that you make moving into the voluntary market and the projects that are sold on that market, these things are connected. So I think a philosophy is useful here. Instead of saying, do this, don't do that, you have to kind of gauge what's important to you, and establish a system in which you're going to make decisions as far as like what's a priority, and what are you willing to trade off on. And you can use metrics instead of binary and saying this is yes, this is a go, this is a no-go. You can weight those and say, what, a penalty charge is important, but it's not quite as important as focusing on the change in your management behavior and the opportunity cost. That's the most important part for me to understand before walking into a carbon contract. So that would be my recommendation. We do have I have been delivering some information, some content, extension content on forest carbon markets for a couple of years now. We have this article available online, questions to ask before joining a carbon program. These are things that my colleague Calvin Norman and I just thought were like kind of maybe good introduction questions, drill down a little bit deeper. But the things like what kind of market does the project sell into? Like who's buying this? Go ahead and look up, what is their ESG agenda rating and their approach, And if they're asking for long commitments, what happens in the case of land transition, or, you know, when you stop owning that land because the contract may be longer than you are? And you know, what are the accidental release? What are your responsibility and what's their responsibility? And then, you know, it's not just how much will I get paid, but like, what's the payment schedule? And sometimes you'll get paid on a regular basis. Sometimes it's going to be a little upfront, a little bit later, you know, and that might determine your ability to participate, especially if you're someone that's like, I need something pretty regular, or maybe you're someone that can wait. And then what happens to my data? Because they're going to use these interactions to help improve their models and help improve their marketing. And that's okay if we're going to be supportive of this, you know, emerging industry. But, you know, maybe that's something you want to ask. So I want to close with basically sort of introducing the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program, which was funded by the USDA last year, and it's going to launch in 2023, so in a couple months here. And the goal of this multi-state, Eastern region focused extension program, which has 13 collaborating land grant institutions and 3 USDA climate hubs are all collaborators of this education program. We're going to be delivering educational content to help support basic literacy in forest carbon and climate issues. We're trying to reach all forest owners. Tools and resources, professional development training for folks who work with private landowners. And we're looking to reach underserved audiences historically, private landowners that don't often have the same access to markets and incentives. The link, I think, is at the very top of the chat box if you want to scroll up. The link is also here on the screen. I'll be sharing my slides. So if you get the slide deck in the email, you can go to all these links. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because this is a pre-marketing website. We don't have the content up yet. That's in 2023. But if you want to be notified when things are available, please go put your name in, and then we will, this is a private list. I won't share it with anybody. And this is just for my own personal, you know, for this program that we can, like, once we have stuff available, we can let people know. So it's sort of an initial kind of, I'm interested. So you're not opting into anything. This is just sort of initial interest kind of thing. So please feel free to register, and then we'll let you know when stuff comes out. And yeah, so that's basically it for my presentation. And let's see, it's 10 to 12, and I'm happy to take questions, and hopefully I can answer some of them. And I want to also crowdsource. I looked through the participant list, and there are other people in that participating in this webinar that are also experts in this subject matter. And I am totally fine if they want to chime in and clarify anything like that too. So I just wanted to open that up.
No, great. Thank you so much for that, Melissa. We do have a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A. You can put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So to start off with what we have, I've got some others that I can toss in as well. So one question is, what is the typical commission a landowner pays to the broker to get his or her income from the sale of carbon credits? So it's that relationship between a landowner and a project developer. And we've got a bunch of them coming up in the future webinars, but interesting.
I like the way that was phrased. First of all, it implied that the project developer was serving the landowner. The project developer, they've already been talking to the buyers, and the buyers have already said, look, this is kind of what we're wanting to pay. And the project developers are going, okay, let me see if I can get forest owners to accept this level of payment, then this is how much commission we can make. And of course, they need a commission in order to help facilitate that transaction. So it is, I have yet to have heard a situation where a project developer said, you know, we typically charge a rate of 10%. Maybe they do. Maybe this coming week, they're going to tell you the commissions that they make. I ran some numbers. This is not published data or anything, but I had the same question. And I think the commission, it varies probably significantly, anything from 10% to maybe up to 40 even. It really depends on what they can, how much they can get from the buyer and then how much they can get from the landowner as far as like payment levels. So they're negotiating two different ways, almost simultaneously, but they started the conversation with the buyers first. And that's because that's how they had to like set up their program and these projects in the first place. They had to know that there were going to be buyers out there, and kind of, getting the landowners involved is kind of like on the later stage of their business plan. And so I would encourage you to ask that question, because it's going to be different for every program.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Next question, and this gets at the, I think this is a question that comes up a lot, the carbon sequestered in the forest and the carbon stored by wood products. So this question is, when you cut your forest, the lumber removed, does it represent sequestered carbon, the wood used in the market, and then additional sequestering begins with reforestation? So it's that question of whether the wood is counted as part of your credits. How is it counted in the model? How do we think about that part?
Yeah. So there, I didn't have time, but I usually show this other study that was done in California, where they did this cradle to grave analysis, and they looked at multiple scenarios. They looked at the scenario of a no harvest situation and climate benefits related to a no harvest situation over time. And then they looked at the climate benefits of a situation where there was harvesting at regular intervals, with the idea that once that wood leaves the forest and turns into a product that continues to hold on to that carbon, that they've tracked that. And then they look at not only that carbon that continues to be stored, but how that product offsets the use of other products that have a larger fossil fuels kind of impact. So this is that cradle to grave analysis. Overall, when forests are managed and harvested on a regular basis, the benefits to climate are greater overall, because of they're storing carbon outside the forest, and we're not having to keep it all inside the forest. Now you may be saying, well, great, I should be compensated for this, but unfortunately, that's not how markets work. So the carbon marketplace works with this verification of additionality, that a change in management behavior has occurred that has led to the additional storage of carbon. So the wood products for sale right now is a business as usual model. It is not additional. Therefore, we can't promise that an offset has been created. How do we get wood products into an offset project? I don't know anyone's doing that yet. And the only way I can figure that could be done and fall in the category of being an additional carbon storage is that those wood products, like let's take the example of biochar. Biochar is a great place to store carbon for a very long time. It is not a dominant product right now. It is really kind of relegated to a minor kind of status. But if investors and a project developer were able to increase the production of biochar by like tenfold, and they said, if it wasn't for this program, that biochar would not have existed, that's the evidence of additionality. So it has to be linked to the payment changed someone's behavior, and it created something completely new that would not have happened otherwise. So it's more of following those rules that have to do with talking about the value of it in an offset market. Now, it has value to society. Thank you, people who harvest your trees and turn them into wood products. I enjoy using those products, and they have a benefit to society. But the way that the rules are set up for an offset is that there has to be evidence of additionality.
Yeah. Let me jump in on that. There is Georgia State Legislature did pass something, and they are working on this with the Georgia Forestry Commission and Georgia Forestry Association, where if you're going to build a mass timber building or using mass timber CLT instead of steel or something different, that is additionality, and they're working on how that can be carbon credits that either the developer would hold it or they may be able to sell it. So there is some pioneer efforts on the state level to try and tackle what you just explained. So we're all waiting to see their success in that and how that turns out.
That, yes, and I think we're going to see this come down the pipe. So the USDA recently sent out a call with I can't remember how many billions of dollars in money to support investment or exploration into developing climate smart commodities on private lands. And everyone, I think, probably knows about this at this point. And so I think out of that particular grant program, it's going to come a whole bunch of really great ideas. So they're not doing research. They're actually trying to make legitimate carbon smart commodities come from private lands, come from ag lands. And so this is that space where these things that we're talking about might be able to come about.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. Next question is from a landowner who is enrolled in a carbon exchange for 2022, only not to harvest in 2022. And they want to know, will the 1-year contracts continue that? And I think they're likely speaking to NCX, the 1-year contracts, and curious if that contract option is going to be something that continues.
Yeah, I guess you have to ask NCX. I don't
Yes,
really
they
know.
will be coming up in a few weeks later in the series, so you'll be able to speak directly with them.
Yep.
So I'll toss out a question while we're waiting for any additional questions. Is, you've provided so much amazing today. If there were 3 key things for landowners to think about as they're contemplating this market and how they manage their lands and what their goals are, what would be the 3 top pieces of advice or things to think about you would want the landowners participating today to walk away with?
I should have prepared for this, but
Hard to pick just
I think one thing I would say is it's okay to not enroll. I know that all the project developers coming up this week are like, no, don't say that. We need participation. But and they do in order for this thing to demonstrate scalability. All these different innovations and ideas all these project developers have and all these programs have, they can't turn it into something better and something stable, and they can't include private lands in climate solutions without actually proving it on these lands without your participation. So I would say I don't do something that you just don't feel comfortable with. You have to acknowledge, like, this is an investment that comes with a certain level of risk, and be accepting of that. Nothing's going to be 100% secure. So maybe when you move into this space, find out other reasons why you're doing it. If your reason is purely one that's based on an economically rational, smart investment choice, this is not the time in the stages of development for, that's a later adopter stage. But if you think that you're someone who's interested in making sure that this succeeds and can play out, and you're willing to be part of it, part of that effort at this point in time in human history about whether or not we can accomplish these kinds of things through using a capitalist type system to address our environmental and social and problems through capitalist type solutions, then throw your hat in and say, okay, I'm gonna try and put my vote in here. But you have to really just be fully acknowledge why you're doing this, and then talk to people who have been enrolled before and what they think. And there's we will be having coming out in our in the upcoming FOSSE program is that we have case studies from forest owners who talk about programs that they are enrolled in and their experience and what that looked like, why they got involved, how they made the decision, what they got out of it, you know, and these stories can kind of, if you kind of identify with who they are and what they're saying, then you can have some confidence that maybe, okay, maybe this is a good choice for me. So yeah, so that's the long answer to, like, think about really why you would get involved, and or do you fit that early adopter model? Let's see. I think the other thing too is ask questions, because the questions that you ask, they may not be able to answer right away, but they are listening. And the things that you care about, they are going to respond to. And so they can't respond to someone who's silent.
Right.
So ask questions, and then they can you know, come up with ways to engage you that is more meaningful then. So it's sort of like the long game. Yeah, we're asking questions for the short gain of the information, but also the long game of helping project developers understand what it is that you're looking for.
That's great. Thank you. And we had a couple more questions come in, so I'll see if we can get them while we still have people. This question is whether a forest that is run for timber production with plans to continue that timber production really has hopes of participating in the carbon market. I have a feeling the answer is it depends, but toss that question to you. Does active land for active forest, active timber management, can that be put in the carbon market? Can that work?
Not at current prices. The trade-off's not equivalent. So one day, maybe, yeah. You know, the whole problem too with this relates to leakage and this concept of how now shall we use our forest lands. In order to address the leakage problem and in order to maintain, you know, domestic timber supply to meet the demands of people in your state and in the nation, we really need to have carbon to be priced a little higher. And that's because then that allows that kind of the economic system to kind of help balance what the priorities are, because the social value of mitigating climate change is huge. I mean, like, that's the numbers that, you know, that come out of Washington. I've put the dollar values, I think is now around $50 some per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions offset. And so that's not at all near what the prices are. So right now, these are kind of baby prices, and society wants something more. And so if we can get to a stage where carbon and timber are a little bit more evenly matched and priced, then, you know, what society wants as far as climate regulation or timber supply can be a little bit is more even-handed. And then you guys, the producers, can just make better decisions about which one to invest in. You can respond a little bit more intentionally to the demand, but right now it's kind of layered. The value is not very high, and the demand by the buyers, the corporations, the way that they have set up what they want, the way they want to do things is kind of constrained. So I see this as being a relatively immature market that's kind of small-minded in the way that they have set themselves up. There's a lot more space to grow here. So if you're in timber production, keep doing that. That sounds good.
Sounds great. One more question. How does tree age affect the ability to participate in the carbon market? So younger trees, older trees, and the ability to jump into this.
Right. So tree age does have an influence. All trees sequester carbon, all trees store carbon, but they do differently at different ages and also at different stand densities and based on tree type too. So there's a lot of variables at play here. So in the offset market though, what they're looking for is in the context of keeping carbon in the forest, they're looking for trees that are not terribly old. So they're looking for young, anywhere from young to middle-aged trees. And they're also considering tree types because species that are not long-lived, so like an aspen stand, if you have one of those and it's about 50, 60 years old and you enter a contract that lasts for like 30 years, those aspen are maybe not going to even reach that. So, you know, it depends on, the type of forest and the age that it's already at. But what they're looking for is its potential to sequester carbon into the future, because You can't sell carbon that's already stored. That's business as usual. You have to store carbon that is going to be sequestered in the future, because now you're creating the situation where that happens. So so that's essentially it. So the way this all comes into the world of averages. So the project developers, they're using their big data. They're looking at like the average age of a stand, and they're looking not at your stand, but they're looking at everyone else's in the surrounding area. And they're identifying places within the United States and regions that have average tree ages that are within some sort of range that they're looking for. And then when you call them and say, I want to enroll in your program, you might be at the upper end of that range or the lower end, but they're going to kind of treat you a little bit the same, because they've already designated this area as having a certain amount of carbon storage potential. And so I guess if I was, if I was the forest owner and I was like thinking, oh, I have a really young forest, the carbon potential is awesome, I should get paid more than the next guy. Unfortunately, that's not the way the big data is set up right now. They've got their averages. So they're going to come look at your stand. They're going to have like this inspection visit. They're going to come by and they're going to be like, okay, what they're doing is they're verifying that your forest falls within the range of their models. And their models are helping them decide how much to pay you. So when the guy comes to visit you, it's not like you're going to debate with them and be like, look, my stand is on average younger than anyone else's in the neighborhood, so I'm expecting a bigger value. That person you're talking to is not necessarily the one you're negotiating with. They have their models that have certain expectations of the carbon potential of the whole region and how much they can pay in order to, kind of get at that potential. So it's not the same kind of, like, historically forestry has been about, a handshake deal with the logger, with the mill, the people you work with. It's a different system. It's set up differently. So I can appreciate that that's a little confusing.
Great. And we got one more in. So this one's about the different carbon pools, above ground, below ground soils, and how the different, how the protocols and the projects take that into account. So are we only looking at above ground biomass, what's in the tree, or did they also take into account what is in the soils and below ground biomass?
So the offset has to be a change in carbon. So it's whatever that you can manipulate. So you can manipulate the trees. You can manipulate the surface of the soil. So, and there's a lot of carbon in that litter too. So I think some programs have protocols as far as, like, if you are going to do harvesting, you have to harvest above a certain baseline. And then when you do, you have to take steps to minimize erosion or any disturbance to the topsoil. That there's some people do take that into account. Some of the project developers do, and others, they ignore the soil. But the soil is just like it's the surface of the forest floor is just like just a small fraction of the carbon in the forest that can be influenced, manipulated. The rest of it's kind of a little bit deeper. So you can't make, that soil sequester more carbon if you wanted to. You don't have any really way to manage that. So soils are an important part of forest carbon, but how much you can do to it to enhance carbon storage is kind of already been established based on the geology and the fact that it's just inaccessible.
Great.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa and Susie, and for all the participants. I think you did a great job of diving in deep. I would make one comment, how you had a slide where it said you had the ESG and the corporate world, and then you have your carbon providers, and they all kind of figured things out. And then they came to the landowners, and it is kind of like, wait a second, without the landowners, this whole market is, at least when the natural capital side of things wouldn't exist. So I would encourage landowners to continue to stay engaged, because they're now playing catch up and really having a lesson in forestry, timber growing, the economics, and this whole question of additionality. I believe, and we're working on this at the Foundation Association, to engage the ESG and the market providers to have better understanding. But if you lose your land to a hurricane, you go back to Hurricane Michael or the Easter tornadoes or the fires out west, you might be faced with the decision: do you replant and contribute those co-benefits, or do you walk away from it and sell it? And those are questions, you know, could you turn that then into the carbon market
Mhm.
provider? So I think there's a lot of room for growth and better understanding. One thing I think everybody agrees on, the demand for forestry carbon credits is going to outpace the inventory. And so the more we engage, the more we can make this an emerging market that might fit everybody's portfolio to achieve social good and landowner gain. So thank you so
Mhm.
much. I think all the questions have been answered. The webinar will be available. We will send the slide deck out, but we will also have it posted on our Forest Carbon University resources page. So hopefully you'll attend the rest of the webinars and continue to ask questions. Thank you again to everybody.
Thanks, Melinda.